Welcome to this explainer. Okay, so today we're tracing the invisible rules that govern, well, your everyday doctor's visit all the way up to the absolutely mind-bending ethical dilemmas of human enhancement. I mean, we all trust our lives to medical professionals, right? But what actually ensures that trust isn't broken? Today, we are unpacking the fascinating moral architecture of medicine. Let's get right into it.
Here's our roadmap for this explainer. We'll be looking at the four ethical pillars: the physician's code, life, death and dilemmas, the biotech frontier, playing God with genetics, and finally, science outpacing human wisdom.
Section 1. The Four Ethical Pillars, the Bedrock of Medicine.
So, medical ethics is essentially the ultimate guide for how doctors must behave. It's an applied branch of ethics, which means it isn't just, theoretical philosophy up in the clouds. It's deeply practical. Because without this strict moral compass, we see some extreme real-world violations. For example, the source material highlights this truly shocking case of medical fraud where a hospital in Vadodara falsely labeled kidney patients as HIV positive just to run an illicit organ trade. Medical ethics exists precisely to stop that kind of horrifying exploitation in its tracks.
The absolute most crucial point here is that every single medical decision relies on these four pillars. First up, beneficence. That's the idea that any medical interference must actively do good for the patient. Second is non-maleficence, which you probably know as the famous Hippocratic Oath concept to do no harm. Third is autonomy, meaning the absolute right of the patient to make their own choices regarding their treatment. And finally, justice, ensuring the fair distribution of healthcare resources. So, every time a doctor prescribes a pill, suggests a surgery, or honestly even just tells you to get more sleep, they're silently balancing these four foundational ideas.
Moving on to Section 2. The Physician's Code, applying the pillars in the clinic.
Now what's really interesting is how these broad pillars translate into a very strict code in the real world. The Physician's Code mandates clear, scientific practices to protect you, the patient. For instance, doctors are expected to prescribe drugs with their generic names whenever possible, rather than pushing expensive brand names. They're also legally and ethically bound to maintain patient records for exactly 3 years from the start of treatment. This just ensures accountability and the rational use of medications across the board.
The code also explicitly bans monetary conflicts of interest. Doctors absolutely cannot accept kickbacks, gifts, or commissions from pharmaceutical suppliers. No way! They also can't use touts or agents to round up patients, and they're forbidden from running an open shop to sell medications prescribed by other doctors. The prime objective here must always remain service to humanity, not, maximizing profit through shady backdoor deals.
Furthermore, because their service is literally essential to humanity, the code takes a really firm stance on strikes. While we do see it happen, it's actually considered unethical for physicians to withhold medical services through strikes. And get this, while a doctor isn't bound to treat every single person who asks during normal circumstances, they absolutely cannot arbitrarily refuse to treat a patient during an emergency. The pillar of doing good overrules everything else in a crisis.
Section 3. Life, Death, and Dilemmas, when the code is stress-tested.
So what happens when black and white rules collide with the agonizing realities of terminal illness? The ancient Hippocratic Oath strictly ordains that doctors must maintain the sanctity and dignity of life. It explicitly says, "I will give no deadly medicine to anyone if asked, nor suggest any such counsel." This rule was set up to make sure a doctor's skills are never, ever abused to end a life.
And this brilliantly illustrates our first major dilemma. We've got a strict rule against deadly medicine on one side, but on the other, the agonizing reality of terminal illness. The source material points out that when caring for patients with an irreversible, life-threatening disease, a time comes when it's actually appropriate for a doctor to stop trying to prolong the misery. It really forces us to ask, at what point does preserving the sanctity of life actually strip away a patient's dignity? Balancing these two forces is, without a doubt, one of the heaviest burdens in medicine.
As we leave the traditional clinic, we have to ask ourselves a really profound question. How are these ancient ethical pillars going to survive the incredibly fast-moving technologies of tomorrow? What happens when the power to heal becomes the power to redesign life?
Section 4. The Biotech Frontier, when science outpaces wisdom.
We are now literally capable of synthetic biology. That is the actual construction of completely artificial life forms and the radical redesign of existing organisms. It's wild, but this is a poorly understood frontier. It requires what researchers call responsible innovation, because if this science is hard to contain, it could inadvertently enable massive hazards like biological weapons.
The pillar of non-maleficence, doing no harm, takes on a profound global scale when we're talking about redesigning biology itself.
A perfect example of this tension is genetically modified organisms, or GMOs. This is a super polarized, multi-dimensional issue, and we really need to weigh both sides impartially. On one hand, GMOs offer the incredible promise of enhancing global food security and putting an end to malnutrition. But on the other hand, there are serious ecological concerns. We're talking biodiversity loss, limited testing due to a huge rush to market, and negative impacts on non-GMO farmers. It's just a massive balancing act of risks and rewards.
Section 5. Playing God with Genetics, Rewriting Humanity. Things get even more intense when we talk about designer babies. Inheritable genetic modification could be a medical miracle, potentially stopping devastating genetic diseases before a child is even born. But it raises severe ethical fears. Many argue it's fundamentally unnatural, and more pressingly, it could create an entirely new societal divide. Imagine a genetically modified class or race of children who possess inheritable advantages over non-modified kids. The whole concept of equality is heavily threatened here.
Let's move over to the cloning debate and see how this builds on that idea of playing God. Cloning forces society to draw a very hard line. Reproductive cloning, actually producing human clones, is largely banned globally to protect human dignity and individuality. But therapeutic cloning, which uses stem cells to potentially cure diseases, well, that continues. And it sparks an intense, ongoing debate regarding the ethics of using human embryos for research, even if that research could one day cure a disease you or a loved one might face.
Tying this directly back to our first ethical pillar of justice, we face a massive crisis of access. Clinical trials rely on human participants who bear the burden and risk of testing new treatments. Yet, when these expensive new biotech treatments finally hit the market, they're heavily protected by patents. This creates a huge gap. The people who took the risks in trials and those who need the treatments most often just can't afford them. Governments are constantly grappling with how to balance the financial rewards necessary to drive innovation against the universal human right to healthcare access.
Section 6. Science Outpacing Human Wisdom, the Ultimate Cliffhanger.
Our scientific abilities are moving so much faster than our ethical guidelines right now. Just look at the expanding blind spots. We have animal rights issues as animals are increasingly exploited, sometimes custom bred for genetic experiments or to grow future donor organs. Then there's data privacy. Precision medicine requires massive datasets of our biological information, often pulled directly from the smartwatches and health apps we use every day, which makes true patient consent incredibly difficult. And finally, human enhancement technologies. Things like brain-computer interfaces threaten to create massive, unnatural cognitive advantages that are reserved only for the privileged elite.
The source material summarizes this entire tension beautifully with a quote. It says, "Technology shaped by values of inclusive good, or gain amassed by some at cost of human lives unseen." It really presents us with two very different futures for humanity. Will we choose an inclusive good, ensuring these miraculous advancements actually heal everyone? Or will we allow immense gain to be amassed by a privileged few, while unseen human lives bear the cost?
Which leaves us to ponder this final, absolutely crucial point. Every new power we gain currently outstrips our understanding of its reach. So what do you think? Are we, as a global society, wise enough to establish the necessary boundaries of restraint before it's simply too late to turn back? Thank you for exploring these massive questions with me today in this explainer. Until next time, keep questioning the world around you.